And we are live. For those of you that are joining on LinkedIn, please pop me a comment and let me know, because last time the LinkedIn stream was a little choppy. I already got a comment. I'd like to see that. Just keep in mind, I am streaming on YouTube as well as an alternate stream, so I can pop that link to you if you're having trouble on LinkedIn. But hopefully LinkedIn is smooth this time. I got Tim Crawford, and this is really a delight for me because I've been wanting to get you in the hot seat for so long. So welcome.
Hey, thanks for having me, John. It's always great to engage with you when we see each other kind of on the road. And so, I've been kind of one of those longtime listener, first time caller, first time participating, right? Because I'm kind of off in the shadows, sometimes commenting myself on LinkedIn.
So I don't do formal intros. You guys know that. Hey, Thomas, great to see you. I'm sure you're going to have a lot to say about this. I don't normally do formal intros, but I want to tell you a little bit about what you have in store for you today. We're going to do a whole CIO in the pressure cooker, about 40 minutes of discussion on that. That's going to be super interesting because that's right in Tim's domain. And then we're going to push into a discussion on next-gen analyst relations. And Tim, I got a cool thing for you about Josh. Josh actually changed his plans today, his travel commute plans, in order to be here for this discussion.
Dude.
So, yep.
Yeah, that's so cool. Thanks, Josh.
Yeah.
I mean, you're awesome. Even before you change your plans, you're awesome. So glad you could join us.
And Jason, hey, nice to see you. And Jason, I'm going to be pinging you on our conversation we've had in the back channel, just FYI. But bear with me, I got some travel coming. So I don't usually do big bios, but I do want to do real quick on how do you get on my show, right? And why is Tim here? So Tim is what you might call one of my favorite pesky questions specialists. So what started to happen is I would go to these analyst events and I'd be like, who's this guy asking this this question that really cuts through the noise and consistently? And then I started getting to the point where, Tim, pretty much every time you had your hand up, I'd be like, okay, this is going to get interesting. And generally speaking, what you do at these events is you ask questions that I find cut to the chase in terms of what customers care about. Because a lot of times that sounds really simple, like why would we be talking about other things besides what customers care about? But as we know, including my 4,000 word piece on AI agent hype that I just published, there's a lot of hype out there and a lot of misdirection. And you have this way of just bringing things back. So we're going to get into how you think about the market. But that's what I've noticed about you is you want to always bring this back to what this means for customers.
Yeah. And I think, part of that, John, not getting into my bio, I mean, I'm pretty public online in terms of who I am and what I've done and what I stand for. But the thing is, I'm not a career analyst. And so I've been a customer of most of these enterprise hardware, software services companies at some point in my career. I mean, I've led IT organizations and have served as a CIO in the past. So I come from that customer standpoint. When we're sitting with an SAP, for example, guess what? I've been an SAP customer twice over, right? There aren't a lot of analysts that have gone down that path and have that experience. And so not to pick on the analyst necessarily, but my point is that's how I'm wired. And so when I'm coming into these conversations, I'm coming into it as if I were a customer. And that's the lens I'm looking through first and foremost. And then, of course, thinking about the other pieces around partners and vendors and the rest.
And one of your core areas, of course, is their domain of the CIO and how that is under disruption and changing. And there you also bring hands-on experience. So that's an important point I wanted to mention to our listeners. You're not just assessing this from an analyst viewpoint. You have been in that seat. You have faced those pressures. I'm sure you have had some really fun security discussions, for example, with colleagues, and you've experienced all that firsthand. So
yeah, you want to see the scars, or we're not going there.
Yeah,
I mean, you're absolutely right. I mean, I've had CISOs and built security organizations over the course of my career. So yeah, I've been there. I've done that. I've walked a mile in those shoes, and I think that's it's kind of a unique perspective to bring into these conversations, which then makes it an incredibly rich conversation, especially when you're talking about vendors that don't necessarily have that firsthand domain experience.
Yeah, and Thomas agrees. As an analyst, one also needs to work with the buyer side. It helps tremendously.
And John, I was just, sorry to interrupt. I was just going to say, the other piece to set the context for this conversation is a full 50% of the work I do is still advisory and engagement with other CIOs. So this is another unique attribute of the work I do versus others is a full 50% is with other customers. And then the other 50% is working with the vendors. And so that brings a lot of iterative domain experience, ongoing domain experience into the fold and into the conversation. So
nice. So we should have a low amount of BS in this conversation. I probably won't have to press the bullshit button today. So that's cool. And we will be getting back to this analyst piece, but just so y'all know that I really want to hone in on some CIO issues. And for those of you who have watched my show for a while, this is going to be a bit of an old school countdown structure where we get into some of the misconceptions about CIOs and then some stuff around where to go from here and with the CIO role. But before we do that, Tim, I want to ask you a question, which is a little bit of a loaded question. But when I think about CIOs, I think I have in my mind sort of a definition of a modern CIO that I juxtapose pretty dramatically with what you might consider a classic inward-facing, keeping the lights on type of approach to the CIO role. But do you accept that framework? Modern is obviously kind of a cheesy ass word. There's other ways of describing it. But do you accept the framework that the CIOs, in order to be business relevant and current to our concerns now, need to go through some type of change? Do you accept that, or how do you look at it?
Totally. And the way I look at this, and I've talked about this for some time, I even wrote about it several years ago, talking about the persona of the CIO. First and foremost, a CIO is not a CIO is not a CIO. So let's just get that straight. I class them into two categories. And of course, nobody fits into a box. So it's really just a gradient of gray. But at one end of the spectrum is the traditional CIO. Tends to work under more of a command and control mentality and culture, is looking at applications versus infrastructure. And then you have the transformational CIO at the other end of the spectrum. And they might be somewhere in the spectrum. They might have components of one and components of another. But the point is that the transformational CIO is a business leader first who happens to have responsibility for technology. And it's important to understand that because you have to look at the persona of the CIO. You have to look at how they lead their organization, not run, how they lead their organization. And then you also have to think about how the rest of the company looks at the IT organization, right? So there are multiple components that come into play, but you're absolutely spot on right. There is a difference between CIOs that lean more traditional versus transformational. And I will say, in my past, I was a traditional IT leader. I mean, that's where I grew up in the 90s. That's where I grew up, right? That was the way IT operated. Today, you have to be a transformational leader to succeed. And a lot of those traditional ones, and I mentioned this recently at a CIO summit a few weeks ago, amongst a group of 50 CIOs. And I said, look, many of you in this room will not succeed. Mm-hmm. You'll perish. And it was kind of a dramatic statement to make, especially considering the audience. But there's some truth in that too, is that some will have a hard time making that transition. Some will be just fine to make the transition. But your point is still spot on.
Okay. It looks like there might be some LinkedIn slow streaming again. I'm going to paste in the YouTube link just so y'all have it if you're struggling a little bit on LinkedIn. Sorry about that. I think LinkedIn has got some issues they need to work through on that of late, because I was at a LinkedIn program for video practitioners and they had problems with their stream during that too, which was kind of embarrassing, by the way. So yeah, what's interesting, Tim, about that is I think one of the tough things for CIOs is that while that I'm totally with you on that transformational role aspect, there are some components of that traditional role that you can't escape from either, right? So it's a little bit thankless because we're asking CIOs to change, but at the same time, if you get caught in a cybersecurity thing that you should have been prepared for because you didn't like patch, whatever system or whatever was on your watch, well, you screwed up and you're going to face the heat. So like the traditional stuff doesn't really go away either. It's like you got to have all that sorted and then the new stuff, right?
Of course. I mean, from an operations standpoint, you still have to have that underfoot. That doesn't go away. That never goes away, right? But it becomes more table stakes. It is not the front and center of this is what we do. This is part of, you get up in the morning, you brush your teeth, you get dressed, you work. I was going to say you go into the office. We'll probably be getting back to that again. But my point is, there are certain things that you must do as a CIO. And operationally, you got to keep the trains running on time. Bottom line. If you can't do that, I guarantee you will not be able to be invited and participate in those strategic conversations, those transformational conversations. So I do think that this is part of that transformation of the persona that needs to take place is, how do I start to, not just myself as a CIO, but my organization, how do I get them oriented such that they are making sure that the trains are running on time? Because that doesn't go away. That doesn't automagically just disappear. And now I just get to do all the rainbows and roses. That isn't how it works. More gets added to the plate. Stuff doesn't come off the plate. And so that's part of that kind of psychological shift that needs to happen in terms of the persona. But yeah, you've got to keep the trains running on time. Bottom line.
By the way, Thomas, a couple things. First, I do have an applause meter as well, in case you're wondering. I have been known to use it if someone's really knocks me over with something. And Thomas,
you can put that one away.
Thomas, yeah, you seem to be doing okay over on LinkedIn at the moment. So if you can keep me posted, Thomas, on how that's going. And also, you have a question for Tim. How far are CIOs wanted to be business leaders by the line of business head?
So it's a great question, Thomas, and great to see you on the chat. Hopefully we'll cross paths again soon. I guess the thing I would say is that, again, this goes back to the individual CIO. Do they want to be this transformational person? And then does their leader, like if they report to the CEO or if they report to the CFO, does that other person view the CIO's role as strategic? And then you have the broader, kind of to your question, you have the broader context of, does the rest of the company, does the line of business leader look to the CIO as a true partner in conversations around technology? So if I'm the CMO and I'm looking to address some specific business functions or outcomes that are part of the leadership team's objectives, am I inviting the CIO to the conversation and say, okay, I want you to take part in this marketing conversation, or the COO talking about, some of the supply chain pieces? How do I start to get to a point where I change the perception? And this starts with the CIO. It doesn't start with the line of business. It starts with the CIO. But how do I start to change the minds of those other LOB leaders so that they look at me, if I'm the CIO, they look at me as, you know what? I'm a strategic business partner for you. I'm not just a technology leader. And when you start to do that, that's when the magic really starts to happen. But there are a number of steps to be able to get there. We're not there generally yet.
Yeah, I think we'll get back to those steps a little bit. Ashish has a question that kind of builds on this. The whole discussion about CIO, AI focus pivot for CIO is making the rounds, and it reminds Ashish of the chief data officer and chief digital officer 7-8 years back, and he's checking your views that will this be a transitionary stage or here to stay?
Yeah, great question. I wrote about the CDO when it started to come up, and I stand by it still. And frankly, it's starting to play out. And quite frankly, the CAIO is going to follow in the same steps, which is, if you're hiring a CDO, you probably don't have the right CIO. That was the bottom line of my post. If you're hiring a CDO, you probably don't have the right CIO. Because that's really what the CIO, the Chief Information Officer, should be doing. I mean, technology is going to come and go, just like AI. in the last 12 months, there's been a marked decline in the number of conversations and the intensity and frothiness of the conversations around AI amongst CIOs. Why is that? Well, it's because it's not about the technology. It's about what we're trying to do, what we're trying to accomplish from a business standpoint. So that's one particular piece, is that I think the CIO will follow much more quickly than the CDO in that same pathway. But then the second piece to this, and this is where I get a little testy with it, with CDO, CAIO.
And here we go.
Is
war on monikers. I love it.
Okay. Well, the same thing, John, is come up around, should we change the title of the CIO? Hogwash. Like, let's just make the CIO do what the CIO should be doing and call it a day. Mm-hmm. And the other piece to this, and this is where I get a little testy, is we keep wanting to throw these chief officer, right? The C and the O. We want to keep throwing these chief officer titles around. But the reality is, these are not chief officer titles. These are not at the same level as a CEO, CFO, CMO, COO. They are absolutely not CHRO. They are absolutely not. There are probably 5 chief officer titles.
But Tim, they look so good on business cards. They're so sexy and cool.
But this is
impress your friends.
Fine. So this is one of the problems that we have with CIOs today. There are a number of CIOs that are out there today that have the title because they were an IT director and they got a promotion. But they didn't necessarily they didn't elevate themselves or were elevated by their leadership team to expect a different outcome. They're still doing IT director work or VP of IT work, but they have that CIO title. Yet, here's the test. They're not seen as part of the executive leadership team. They're not at the same table as the CEO, CFO, CMO, COO.
That's a tough test, but I think a fair one. Marine says, amen on the hogwash points. And by the way, Marine, great to see you. And thanks for staying up late. Glad to have you in the chat as always. And Josh is saying about not just the Department of No, but I think where Josh is going there, in my view, that's kind of interesting is around not so much no, but that one of the problems with the CIO historically was being too much of a bottleneck for business requirements and stuff like that. And in my mind, that's one of the things the CIOs really have to step back, and it's like their criteria should be, if I equip the business to build applications quickly that are compliant, secure, I've done my job, and I can step out of the way and not be controlling everything. So maybe that's a little bit of a compromise between what Josh is saying and your view. I don't know.
What Josh is highlighting, quite frankly, is IT, not the CIO specifically, but the IT organization has been known as the Department of No. And having done a number of assessments since I have left my last IT leadership role, I will tell you that there are kind of 2 buckets that kind of contribute to that. You have one that's for good reasons and one that's for bad reasons. And the bad reasons is you've got organizations out there that they just make it really hard to work with them. And so, of course, nobody wants to work with IT because inevitably it's too hard. There's too much friction. And so this is where you start to get shadow IT in some cases, right? Is that I'm just not working with IT. They always say no to my request. And frankly, sometimes it's because they're not really good communicators as to why. And sometimes they're just not understanding what the problem is and how this ties to some business outcome. That's the bad side. The good side is when there's complexity in IT. Now, you can agree or disagree till the cows come home as to whether there should or shouldn't be complexity in technology. The reality is it's there. So until you accept that, until you respect that, you're going to have a really hard time. And so one of the challenges is it puts a higher onus on the IT organization to effectively communicate why that complexity exists. So it could be for regulatory or compliance reasons. It could be because we've been running 30-year-old architecture. And guess what? We just don't have the funding to be able to do it because we've been having to spend our resources on getting you the next best thing. But you have to effectively communicate that. And this is, technical debt starts to eke its way into this as well. But it's important to understand those dynamics. And that, frankly, gives you a better appreciation. But let's be honest, a lot of IT organizations struggle to communicate and effectively market themselves internally. And that contributes to that.
Josh is proposing chief hogwash debunker. I'm not sure that's going to catch on, Josh, but I like the spirit of it. I want to hit on a few comments.
Yeah.
And then we'll see where we go from there. So, hey, Sam, sorry LinkedIn's eating your comments. But yeah, hallucinations, I suppose, are in play. Keep trying, folks. And I did paste in the YouTube link as well. And then Marine says that no one wants to work with IT as a mirror for what's going on with ops teams. Interesting parallels there, which I find in general, this sort of fight of admin versus strategic is kind of everywhere and just has a different kind of flavor to it. And Thomas is talking about complexity. In his experience, IT complexity goes up the more IT reduces complexity for a line of businesses. That's an interesting concept. Instead of getting rid of complexity entirely, can you hide it from the user? In some ways, that can be pretty effective too.
My belief, Thomas, is that's a dangerous strategy. Because what happens is you start to pile complexity on top of complexity. I talked a little bit about this in my CIO playbook for 2024, which you can find on my website, avoa.com. Talked a little bit about this, and simplicity is one of the key pieces because our world is getting more complicated, not simpler. And so any opportunities you have to simplify your architecture, simplify the number of vendors you're working with, simplify how your organization works, your decision-making capability, all of those things and many more things, you have to work toward it. If you don't, you're just kicking the can down the road and you run the risk of having it come up at a very inopportune time down the road. And you don't want that.
Thomas agrees on dangerous. He's just making an observation about that. Just as a quick framing, I want to spend about the next 10 minutes or so hammering away at sort of misconceptions and problems and obstacles. Then I want to spend a bit of time kind of going forward on what you think the most effective CIOs are doing to combat some of that so we can have some takeaways here. Sam says Department of No is a great phrasing, but I've also seen Department of Everything Yes, which could be equally worse. And this gets to a point that's on my mind right now, which is AI, because I think there's a misconception amongst some that the job of the CIO is to enthusiastically embrace AI on behalf of the organization. I'm calling bullshit on that. What I think the CIO does, and you can tell me if you agree, I think a good CIO will have a narrative for how AI can effectively be adopted by the organization, what the obstacles are, what the pros and cons are, what the technical limitations are, what the vendor hyperbole is, which is actually what's possible on your project and in your business plan. I'm looking for the CIO to offer a reality check, not just the Department of Yes, as we alluded to in the chat there.
Yeah. I mean, Sam's absolutely right. The Department of Yes is probably worse than the Department of No, because now you are accepting pretty much anything that comes your way. But kind of to your point, John, I actually have a little bit of a different view on that, which is
excellent.
I don't think that governance bodies like your board should be dictating technology. We saw how this kind of played out with regards to cloud. It was bad, right? Where you had governance bodies that were saying, hey, we need to be cloud first. What did that get us? That plus the marketing, which brilliant marketing, cloud is cheaper. Cloud's just someone else's data center. It's easy to use. You just lift and shift. I mean, we've all seen these ramifications that come from this, right? Unfortunately, you see the same thing. And I just tweeted about this. So there's a gentleman at Amazon who does enterprise strategy. And so his name is Tom Godden. And he was talking about this very issue, which is You get the CEO that comes and says, hey, what's our AI strategy? And his point, he was very apropos. Now, mind you, Tom's a former CIO too, which is great. So one of the things that Tom said is when the CEO comes to you and says, hey, what's our AI strategy? What you should be saying is, what's our business strategy informed by AI? And the point of that is really kind of to my earlier point of a governance body or a leader like the CEO should not be dictating technology, but rather we should be orienting and focused around the business objectives, the business outcomes. And then the CIO and the IT organization should determine what's the right technology to bring to bear here. Maybe it's AI, maybe it's Gen AI, maybe.
Right.
Maybe it has nothing to do with it. We just need a relational database.
Agreed, 100%. I just think that AI's, in my opinion, we may have a disagreement here, which is interesting, but in my opinion, like AI is a little bit different because there is a pressure to have an organizational response coming from the board and coming from the use of shadow tools and stuff like that. And I don't think you can simply just be supporting strategic business objectives. Just an example, like I wrote this AI agents piece today, and one of the things that's underlying that is my notion that a lot of folks that are pimping the heck out of AI agents don't understand that the underlying generative technology. Now, not all AI agents rely on generative LLMs and stuff like that, but the ones that do are relying on a flawed technology that is not magically fixed through RAG. I'm sorry, it's just not. And if you really study the AI experts who are trying to solve these problems, they're poignantly aware of this. And someone in the organization has to understand the technology, Tim. And I'm pointing the finger at the CIO for that. They're the ones that have to be able to say, no, you can't use AI agents to resolve major disputes with your top clients and automate that. You can't use it to make buying decisions and purchasing decisions beyond a certain threshold because it's not going to get it right every time. You have to at least have humans supervising this. And if the CIO can't explain the technology, then who can? So that would be my stance on that.
So, John, I don't disagree with any of that.
Okay.
But the piece that I disagree with is when you have a governance body like the board or a senior leader like the CEO dictating technology out of context. And so this is where
right. Inserting technology into a business conversation prematurely. That's what you're objecting to.
That's exactly right.
Yep,
so business first,
I'm good with that.
Technology follows, right?
Right.
And so
the only reason I brought that up is I think sometimes business executives are bringing up the technology before the business case as well.
They are.
So that's my problem with AI, whereas in the past, you didn't see that as much, right? You didn't see that with like metaverse or whatever.
Of course, but we're in a different era where now we have the consumerization of AI, and so everybody gets to see how this kind of plays out. That this is the first time that we've really kind of seen this. We started to see it at the end of the cloud piece, but we're really seeing it with AI. But there's another piece here. Go back to what I was saying about the role of the CIO, and a CIO is not a CIO is not a CIO. If you have a transformational CIO, and I know a number of them, it's not the majority, but I know a number of them, and I will tell you, those folks are not dictated to in terms of which technology to use. They're ahead of it, and they're having the conversation with the CEO, and they are actively engaged with the board and the technology committee and talking about what their strategy is. So instead of the governance body or the CEO or another line of business leader coming to them and saying, hey, I need this AI agent, the CEOs already, or the CIOs already engaged with them and driving that conversation. That's the transformational CIO. And the reason why that's happening is because they're already ahead thinking about the business, the whole business and where it's going. And also they have the relationships with each of those different organizations and line of business leaders to be able to get ahead of it and anticipate what's going to be needed to be discussed. That's very different than a traditional CIO.
Yeah, indeed. Ashish brought up some interesting things around cobots and humans and robots and collaboration. I don't want to go too far into that today because I want to stay focused on the CIO in this conversation, but I think if you read my agents piece, you'll find a lot of action there. And y'all are having fun with my metaverse comment. It was just it was just an example. The fact that we aren't donning crazy headsets for this conversation is a disappointment to some venture capitalists. But sorry, that's just not how the world turns.
Put your aluminum hat on. Here we go.
Hey, by the way, Thomas, if you're still in the audience, I think I might have decisively finally be declared victor of that Web 3.0 debate that we had.
He's there.
I think I won that. Can you give me some kind of prize belt? Anyhow, so Tim, I want to spend a couple more minutes on misconceptions, because I asked you to kind of prepare for us for this conversation, some misconceptions people might have about that role. I'm guessing we probably hit on a couple of them. Are there any that we missed that you really want to hit on?
Let me just kind of run. I've got probably 4 or 5 here that I prepped. So let me just kind of run through them real quick. And,
okay, great.
We could double click on any of them that the audience wants to look at or you're interested in.
Okay, so folks, these are Tim's top CIO misconceptions as we perceive the role. I'm looking forward to this.
Yeah, mistakes and opportunities. And this is not intended to be an exhaustive list. This is top of mind, kind of the common things that keep coming up. Number one is best practices and old playbooks. This worked. CIOs that are thinking, hey, this worked for me 5 or 10 years ago. I'm going to take that playbook and I'm going to play it again. That doesn't work. The world's changed. In fact, if you really wanted to get testy about it, the playbook and the way you ran an IT organization or led an IT organization 5 or 10 years ago need not apply. Like, really, technology organizations have evolved that dramatically in such a short period of time. Number 2 is don't ignore your technology debt. Understand your tech debt. It's not sexy. Let's be honest. It's not sexy. It's not fun to talk about. It's hard to talk about, but you cannot ignore it. And that is not to say, and don't read into the pundits that say that all tech debt is bad. That's crap. Some tech debt is strategic and it makes a lot of sense to keep going with. So make sure that you know what your tech debt is, what you're keeping and what you're not, and what the plan is.
I could think of some airlines that would agree with you, Tim, on that, by the way.
Well, okay, so I've worked with major airlines, so I have a little bit of inside baseball here. But one area there, we're not going to talk about it today, but one area there is mainframes. There is a place for mainframes. So talking about the demise of mainframes is a little premature. That's not to say it's not a blanket statement with any of these, right? So the third item is align your tech strategy and organization with the company objectives. I think this is one thing that often gets missed, is that CIOs and IT organizations don't really understand, like, what is the company doing? Like, how does the company make money? How does the company spend money? They don't get into that level of depth of more than, like a clothing retailer. I sell shirts and pants and people come into stores. You need to understand like dynamics around distribution and manufacturing and timelines and costs and all of that. And who are the players that are involved in it? Number 4 is focus on what matters most to the company. What matters most to the company today, and most of the conversations that are having at a board level and in an executive leadership team, ELT level, are around customer engagement, supply chain. So there's an efficiency conversation, there's a growth conversation, and then opportunity and risk. So where are the opportunities? Where are the risks, right? And then you could talk about cyber, but cyber is just one component of risk. So keep that in mind. And I don't mean just cyber and ransomware and that you're done with risk. Right. Like there's so much more. Right. Number 5 in this is, as I started to highlight, is understand your business intimately all the way through the organization. So the most junior person on the team that's developing code for your company internally, do they know where that code fits in and how that impacts your company? They should. And some of the best IT leaders, they have had their whole organization where they know exactly the value that they are bringing to the company. It's impressive. So that's my top kind of 5 of mistakes and opportunities. Some of those, if we were in a group of CIOs today, an audience of CIOs, they might be scratching their heads going, oh crap, what do I get some work to do?
You sparked some really good conversations with that. I think there was definitely that we could probably spend a lot of time on tech debt. We could probably do a whole show on that, in fact, and maybe we should consider doing that at some point. But just quickly, Josh really would love to hear examples of strategic.
So I'll give you a couple quick examples, Josh. And I think we've even talked about this maybe a little bit. I mentioned mainframe, but quite honestly, it's not about just products. It could be older products. So software services, hardware. I've walked into data centers where they've had literally compact tower systems strapped on a shelf in the data center. How many years has a compact tower system like been out of circulation running Windows 2000? So you have these kinds of tech debt pieces, but it also applies to architecture. So think of all the architectures that were built 10 years ago, 20 years ago, even, and they're still being proliferated today, right? Your EAs or your enterprise architects are still using that kind of fundamental piece. That's a problem. Not all tech debt is old, by the way. Tech debt could have been put in yesterday,
right?
But it's an old way of using it. And then the last is just around process, right? And you're using old processes that need to evolve, but you do it because of this complexity that we talked about. It's not as easy to just say, hey, I can twist this. Guess what? You twist that. It's a ball of yarn. IT is a ball of yarn. You twist this here and it has ramifications through the rest of the organization. It's really complicated.
Maureen, I'm sorry, Gwen Stefani isn't here to sing this. I'm just a girl who needs data. I'm sure she could do it justice. Standing in front of, let's face it, a bunch of guys hoping they'd realize our data categories were invented 25 years ago. They're hard-coded in for an era long past. So she's echoing your old playbooks theme. Well,
she's talking to something, and I just had a conversation a couple months ago with a group of CIOs around data warehouses. And one of them was actually putting in a new data warehouse. And one of the problems is the more structured you get, the more capabilities you have in one direction. But the problem is the more inflexible it is in a different direction. And as we know, even today, with the dynamics of where data is coming from and the velocity and whatnot, and the types of data, it's not as easy anymore to build up a data warehouse that's going to stand the test of time. In fact, most of them that they do stand up, guess what? Day one is great. Day two, they're talking about re-architecting it.
Maureen wants a transcript about those old structures. Maureen, no problem. Ping me. I don't publish transcripts, but I send them to individuals. So if you want one, let me know. And Greg, finally, glad you got the link. Sorry that wasn't coming through. I guess Frank Scott was lurking somewhere in the chat. Frank would love to see your comment if someone can surface it. Frank is formerly retired, but blogging up a storm on his Substack. I highly recommend you track Frank's career reflections because they are really interesting. And then Jason says, you've got the CIO strained business relationships, cloud innovation, and a new era of execs who know enough to propose dangerous solutions on OpEx budgets. In today's world, who owns and is authorized to make changes to enterprise architecture? Wow, Jason, that's a nice can of worms. Thanks.
It's a great question. It's an absolutely great question. And that's part of why the dynamics for IT leadership have got to change, right? You've got to have the right relationships in place, which then gives you a lot of overhead to be able to do things that you otherwise would never be able to do. And you kind of get away from these folks proposing these kind of crazy situations in scenarios and technologies because they're exposed to it, right? They're exposed to more technology today than folks outside of IT, and the everyday layperson is exposed to more technology today than they ever have. And so they can come to you with suggestions and ideas, which can be dangerous. And so if you have the right relationships in place, if you're already getting ahead of where the business is going, those actually become an add-on rather than a sideshow. And that's the piece that kind of comes into your mental model and strategy as a CIO, a transformational CIO, as you kind of work forward.
So I'm with you on that. And I think there's certain kinds of transformational CIOs that just get it. And I wrote about one recently in the context of how they handle this cybersecurity incident and how they're pursuing a real-time framework for their business. That's in my recent articles. And you can tell, Tim, when you're talking to that type of engaged transformational CIO, there's just something, they kind of ooze a certain kind of relevance or something that I really like. But I also kind of think about those that kind of want to make that transition, but maybe it's tougher sledding for them. or maybe they have more organizational resistance. And obviously, in some cases, all you can do is leave and find a more supportive and, aggressive organization or whatever you want to call it. But do you have conversations like that around like how do I kind of move ahead like in that like demystifying the steps? Because I think sometimes it's like, oh, these transformational people, but how do you get to that point? How do you evolve into that?
Yeah, so you're talking about two different dynamics. So one is a vendor and how do they identify those types of personas, those CIOs? Because I said a CIO is not a CIO is not a CIO.
Yeah.
And that's something that I've been coaching vendors on, right? Is what are some of the dynamics? What are some of the factors that you look for? If you're a seller, if you're doing marketing, like what are some of the signals that you're looking for to identify, kind of who this person is and where they sit in that spectrum? And for me, it's kind of natural, but for someone that doesn't work with literally dozens of CIOs every single week, it's kind of hard to tell sometimes.
Mm-hmm.
So understanding what those signals are is important. The other piece is understanding, what you need to do if you're a CIO today and you aspire to transform to that transformational CIO. What are some of the things you do? And I have kind of a quick list that we had talked about.
Let's
that I
run
kind of
through
developed.
those.
All right, so another lightning round. Buckle in. Here we go.
Yeah, here we go.
So number one is stronger C-suite relationships, including audit and legal. So one of the first and second relationships that I would always make is with my head of legal or head of audit and my head of finance. Because I know over time, I'm going to have to regularly engage with these folks. And so I would much prefer to understand who they are, what makes them tick, what they're focused on. So when issues come up, like let's say I have a security breach, one of the more dynamic examples, but not the more common one. But when situations like that come up, guess what? I know exactly what my audit team is going to ask me about. And we have a relationship. And so guess what? I can go to them, like John, I'll use you as the example. I can go to you, John, and say, John, guess what? We had a breach. I know you're looking for X, Y, and Z. Here's what we're doing to work on that. I'll keep you apprised. Let me know if there's anything else you need. And you're going to go, holy crap, this person actually, thought about what's important to me, makes my life a lot easier, right? And we have a pre-existing relationship. So the relationship is not based off of that breach, but it's based off of putting in the work ahead of time. So stronger C-suite relationships. I also say that one of the strongest C-suite relationships that has got to exist in today's era is between the CEO and the CIO. Technology plays such a dramatic and important role to every single business, regardless of industry. And yet that relationship is one of the weakest across organizations. Number two, sustainability. This is not a big topic today. Guess what? It's coming back in vogue. So get ready. There's new legislation that's going to hit January 1st, 2025, that's going to put this on everyone's radar. Guess what? Nobody's prepared for it. Nobody's talking about it. Nobody's thinking about it. And to be fair, it's really complicated what you have to do to go through it. This is not an IT problem, but IT is a big contributor to what needs to be reported as part of your financial reporting. So we're going to be talking about this in the coming year. People are going to have to pay fines until they can kind of ramp up. So I fully expect to see that come back. Number three, and we just saw this just recently with California State Bill 1047, AI legislation. I mean, the Wall Street Journal reported that there's something over 400 pieces of state legislation just in the US alone. I was at the Wall Street Journal's CIO Summit in New York this week. And one of the comments was that there's actually over 800 pieces of legislation that are at different stages through the state legislatures. This is not federal, states. California has over 30. So as a CIO, as an organization, forget about the CIO, as an organization, they've got to start getting their heads around this. And it's going to be really complicated and really hard to follow, but you don't have a choice. You gotta strap in. You got to strap in. And that's just state. That's not counting anything federal. That's not even counting global. So global, you get even, the complexity starts to grow because then you start to get into sovereignty rules and the rest. And then you have industry as well. And then the last
Tim, just one sec. Brian, on the video, it seems like some people are having luck watching on YouTube and commenting on LinkedIn. So have someone post a YouTube link for you. Sorry that the stream's getting hung up. Glad to see you here. Oh my God, the collective brain wattage in this chat is through the roof right now. Thanks for being here, folks, and fighting through some of the technical things. Yeah, go on, Tim. Sorry.
Yeah, no, the comments are just fabulous. I love it. I love the engagement. We need to have more of this, quite honestly.
Yep.
So the last thing that I was just going to say, and it kind of puts a cap on what I've been talking about to this point, is the role of the CIO. We need to have a more candid, open conversation about what the role of the chief information officer is and does, so that role really does get to that transformational level and is seen as a peer amongst the ELT, no different than the CFO, CEO, CMO, COO, CHRO, those key chief officer roles. And then making sure you have the right CIO that is capable of operating at that role. They might not have the right tone and cadence. And this is one of the reasons why you don't always see CIOs in the boardroom, because quite frankly, some of them that I've met, you don't want them in the boardroom. And when we get into CISOs, it's even worse. So that's a whole another issue. But those are some of the key things that we have to be looking at. And as an IT leader, you absolutely have to be thinking about today.
Great stuff, Tim. We're going to wrap the CIO conversation in just a couple minutes to shift over. But Brian wants to say plus 100 on the ESG point you're making. Brian has written a really good guidebook on ESG I recommend to readers. But one of the things that I think is really important that I like about your work, Tim, is that I think sometimes we fall too much into the vendor narrative, which is so much about AI, but in the customer community, there's other stories emerging, and it's our job to call attention to them. And ESG is one of those stories where it can ebb and flow a little bit, but then you're going to get smacked by a whole new wave of requirements. And where were the people in the customer's ears saying, get ready for this? There needs to be people like that. And so that's part of the goal of these sessions, is to surface that. So thanks for that.
Yeah, I think, John, and I'm sure we'll talk about this in our next part of the next segment in the conversation. But I think many folks have kind of over-rotated to focus on the vendor.
Yep.
And kind of lost touch with what the customer needs to do or how the customer is coming at this. And I think that provides a bit of a skewed perspective. And so what I'm trying to do is, if you will, bring a little bleach to the gene pool and say, okay, can we get real on this?
Yep. So save the rest of that. And then Brian says, I'll bet one of your items will be the need for the CIO to be cosmopolitan, aware of one's environment, and connected to more people than just their staff and a handful of strategic vendor relationships. I think that ties in pretty closely to your points.
Absolutely. CIOs, and I was actually just talking about this week in New York, and I've talked about this before, is that CIOs have been a pretty insular group. In some ways, unfortunately, it's been an old boys club, but that is changing slowly. And so, yes, they have to build relationships outside of the CIO kind of conclave, if you will. There are some that are starting to do that. They need to get exposed to CEO conversations. They need to get exposed to other personas. And that is starting to happen. And the transformational CIOs, they seek that out. The traditional ones don't even know where to start.
Okay, one more. Ashish just wants real quick tips on scaling AI adoption beyond the initial disconnected POCs. I will also add, Ashish, that a lot of POCs for AI don't work very well because it's hard to simulate the impact on live data. So it's a really troubling area in terms of that type of adoption you're describing. Tim, any quick comments on that?
Yeah, I'll just take it a layer above that and say that I think a lot of the POCs start with a false premise of what they're really trying to prove out. And so that once they try and prove it out, they realize there's no, the juice isn't worth the squeeze, right? It's not worth pursuing. There's no, the value isn't there, but they're not tying it to a business outcome, which is meaningful.
And Thomas Wieben says, work with actual business use cases to deliver value. That's never out of fashion, I would say. And the IT jokes, there is a little bit of an irony that we're talking so much about IT today, and I'm actually having IT problems, which is unfortunate, but there you go. Anyway, Tracy, it's great to see you in the chat after a while, so happy to have you back. And KPIs that measure success, and that's a whole nother conversation. So now we actually are going to switch gears to a different topic, and I don't usually do that, but I'm going to switch. I'm going to take a really short pause here.